79 seconds isn't enough time to brew a decent cup of coffee. It's barely enough time to lace your boots. But if you know exactly where the human body breaks, 79 seconds is an eternity, long enough to dismantle 4 grown men and the egos they rode in on. The air conditioning unit in briefing room 4 hadn't worked since Tuesday, and it was currently a blisteringly hot Thursday afternoon in an unnamed transit camp on the border of nowhere. The air tasted like diesel exhaust and stale sweat. Dust coated everything: the cheap folding tables, the peeling linoleum floor, the reinforced glass windows. It was the kind of environment that bred agitation. When highly trained, heavily armed people are bored and uncomfortable, the atmosphere turns corrosive. Cora sat at a corner table, a soiled cleaning rag draped over her left thigh, an assortment of brass brushes laid out with surgical precision on a rubber mat. Her rifle, stripped down to its core components, smelled sharply of solvent. She wasn't a poster child. The media loved the idea of a female SEAL, but they didn't love the reality of Cora. She was 5'8", built like a lightweight boxer, with a nose that had been broken twice and set wrong the first time. Her hair was buzzed close to the scalp, not for style, but because sand and helmet hair bred lice and infections. Her hands were a map of white scars and thick calluses. She looked tired. She was always tired. Across the room sat a detachment from a specialized joint task force. 4 men. Elite, undeniably, but carrying the specific kind of arrogance that came from operating in the shadows with zero oversight. They were contractors now, making triple a standard military salary, wearing unmarked gear and untrimmed beards. Briggs was their apex predator. A man the size of a refrigerator, with arms tattooed from wrist to shoulder and eyes that constantly scanned the room for a challenge. Sitting beside him was Zane, a wiry guy with a permanent chewing tobacco sneer. Miller, a quiet brute whose knuckles looked like crushed walnuts. And Wyatt, the youngest of the 4, desperate to prove he belonged with the big dogs. They had been throwing glances at Cora for the better part of an hour. It started as low murmurs, the distinct abrasive sound of men whispering in a quiet room. Cora ignored it. She had ignored it in Coronado. She had ignored it in the freezing mud of San Clemente Island. She had ignored it during the punishing surf torture, when instructors looked at her just a fraction of a second longer than the men, waiting for her to quit. She had earned her trident in the dirt and the blood, paying a physical toll that most human beings couldn't fathom. But to guys like Briggs, she was an anomaly, a glitch in the matrix, a political stunt pushed through by brass who wanted good PR. "I'm just saying, standards change," Briggs's voice suddenly carried across the room. He wasn't whispering anymore. "You lower the bar enough, anyone can step over it." Zane chuckled, spitting a stream of brown liquid into a plastic water bottle. "Check the box, get the funding. That's how Washington works." Cora kept scrubbing the bolt carrier group of her rifle. Her expression remained entirely blank. The metal was warm under her fingertips. She focused on the mechanical rhythm. Scrub, wipe, inspect. "Hey, SEAL!" Briggs didn't bother using her name. He stood up. The scraping of his metal folding chair against the linoleum was loud, abrasive. He walked across the room, his boots heavy on the floor, projecting an aura of physical dominance. He stopped at the edge of her table, casting a shadow over her disassembled weapon. "You deaf or just ignorant?" Briggs asked. Cora didn't look up. "I'm busy." Her voice was raspy, dry. She didn't sound intimidated. She sounded bored. "Busy," Briggs repeated, looking back at his crew. Miller snorted. Wyatt shifted in his seat, leaning forward to watch the show. Briggs looked back down at her. "We were just having a debate. about load-bearing limits. See, human biology is a funny thing. Bone density, muscle mass. You can train all you want, but nature is nature. I'm just trying to figure out how someone your size hauls a 200-pound casualty out of a kill zone. Adrenaline, Cora said simply, wiping down the firing pin. Bullshit, Briggs snapped. I think someone else carried your weight. I think the instructors looked the other way because they had orders from the top. You wear the bird, but you didn't earn the sky. Cora finally stopped. She set the firing pin down on the mat. She looked up at Briggs. Her eyes were a flat, pale grey. There was no anger in them, which seemed to infuriate Briggs even more. Anger he understood. Anger he could work with. Cold, detached observation made him feel small. If you have a problem with my qualifications, take it up with Naval Special Warfare Command, Cora said. Her tone was terrifyingly calm. Until then, step out of my light. I'm trying to see this carbon scoring. Briggs's jaw tightened. The veins in his thick neck pulsed. He wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not by a woman who weighed 80 pounds less than him. He needed to reassert control. He needed to humiliate her. He reached out, incredibly fast for a big man, and snatched the upper receiver of her rifle right off the rubber mat. The room instantly went dead silent. In their world, you do not touch another operator's weapon. It was an intimate, unforgivable violation of boundaries. It was a physical challenge. Briggs held the heavy piece of metal in his massive hand, smirking down at her. "Show us then, SEAL," Briggs whispered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Show us what makes you so special. Take it back." Cora stared at the empty space on her mat. Then she looked at the upper receiver dangling from his grip. Finally, she looked at Briggs. She didn't sigh. She didn't glare. She just slowly pushed her chair back and stood up. Cora wasn't wearing body armor, just a faded grey t-shirt, tan tactical pants and boots. Briggs, on the other hand, was strapped into a chest rig, his frame imposing and rigid. He expected a tug of war. He expected her to grab the rifle barrel, at which point he would easily use his superior upper body strength to yank her forward, unbalance her, and make her look foolish. Cora didn't reach for the weapon. 001 to 012. She stepped into his space, entirely bypassing the rifle. Briggs's brain took a fraction of a second to process that she wasn't playing the game he initiated. In that microscopic window of confusion, Cora's right boot drove downward, the hardened heel stomping viciously into the arch of Briggs's left foot. The tiny, fragile bones of his metatarsals crunched under the sudden, focused weight. Briggs gasped, his posture breaking as excruciating pain shot up his leg. His head dipped forward instinctively. Cora didn't punch him in the jaw. Punches break knuckles. She drove the rigid base of her palm upward, a short, explosive strike straight into the soft cartilage of his throat. It wasn't a lethal blow, but it was enough to crush his windpipe just slightly. Briggs made a horrifying, wet, choking sound, dropping the upper receiver. As it clattered to the linoleum, Cora pivoted, grabbing the collar of his heavy tactical vest, using his own shifting weight to pull him forward while sweeping his injured leg. A 240-pound man fell like a felled oak. His head struck the linoleum with a sickening crack. He was out before his boots settled on the floor. 013 to 034, the three men at the table froze. The transition from mundane bullying to extreme, surgical violence had happened too fast for their nervous systems to catch up. "Briggs!" Zane yelled, the shock breaking. He surged to his feet, kicking his chair away. Miller was right behind him. Zane was fast. He charged across the 10 feet separating them, throwing a wild, looping right hook aimed squarely at Cora's temple. He wanted to knock her out, end it quickly. Cora ducked, slipping the punch with the fluid economy of motion drilled into her through thousands of hours of hand-to-hand combat. She didn't retreat. She stepped inside his guard. As Zane's momentum carried his arm past her head, Cora trapped it. She clamped her left arm over his triceps, locking his arm against her chest, and drove her right elbow directly into the center of his sternum. The impact sounded like a bat hitting a wet sandbag. Zane lost the air in his lungs in a sharp hiss. Before he could recover, Cora twisted her hips violently, applying maximum torque to his trapped extended arm. A loud, unnatural pop echoed in the quiet room as his shoulder dislocated. Zane screamed, a high, reedy sound, dropping to his knees. Cora stepped around him, pushing his collapsing body toward the charging bulk of Miller. 0:35 to 0:58. Miller wasn't fast, but he was wide. He shoved Zane's writhing body aside and lunged at Cora, arms outstretched, looking to grapple her. He knew if he got his massive hands on her, he could crush her. Weight classes exist for a reason. Cora knew it too. She had zero intention of wrestling a gorilla. She backed up, her heel catching the edge of her metal folding chair. Without looking, she reached down, grabbed the chair by the backrest, and swung it upward in a tight arc just as Miller closed the distance. The heavy steel legs caught Miller right across the kneecaps. He roared in pain, his forward momentum instantly halting as his legs buckled. As he dropped his hands to his shattered knees, Cora dropped the chair, stepped in, and delivered a devastating knee strike squarely to the bridge of his nose. Blood sprayed through the air in a fine red mist. Miller's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed backward, a heavy, dead weight on the linoleum. Cora was breathing hard now. The physical exertion was immense. Her knuckles ached, and a sharp pain flared in her ribs where she had twisted too hard, throwing Zane. 0:59 to 0:79. She looked up. Wyatt was the only one left standing. He was standing by the far table, his eyes wide, completely drained of color. He looked at the bodies groaning and bleeding on the floor. He looked at the small, grey-eyed woman standing amidst the wreckage. He made a terrible mistake. Panic overrides training. Instead of backing down, his hand dropped toward his right thigh, instinctively reaching for the holster of his sidearm. It was a muscle memory response to extreme threat, but in a room full of friendlies, it was a death wish. "Don't!" Cora barked, her voice cracking the silence like a whip. Wyatt's hand froze, hovering an inch above the polymer grip of his pistol. He looked at her face. Cora's posture had changed. The defensive, measured violence was gone. If he touched that gun, she would kill him. She had closed half the distance between them in a split second, her center of gravity low, her eyes locked on his hand. "Take your hand away from the weapon, kid," Cora breathed. It wasn't a request. Wyatt swallowed hard. His fingers were trembling. Slowly, agonizingly, he raised his hands to chest level, palms out. Okay, I'm off it." "Sit down," she ordered. Wyatt sank back into his chair, his legs suddenly failing him. Cora held his gaze for 2 more seconds, ensuring the threat was neutralized. Then she let out a slow, controlled breath through her nose. The adrenaline was receding, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity. She walked over to where Briggs lay groaning on the floor. He was conscious, holding his throat, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and confusion. Cora stepped over him, knelt down, and picked up the upper receiver of her rifle. She wiped a smudge of dust off the barrel with her thumb. She walked back to her table, sat down in her chair, and picked up a clean rag. The clock on the wall ticked. 79 seconds had passed. "I prefer silence when I clean my weapon," Cora said to the room at large, her voice completely flat. "If anyone else wants a biology lesson, you know where to find me." She picked up the bolt carrier group and went back to scrubbing. The heavy metal door of briefing room 4 swung open, its rusted hinges shrieking against the sudden silence. Master Chief Henderson stepped over the threshold. He carried a clipboard and an insulated mug of black coffee, his expression permanently set in a state of exhausted annoyance. Henderson was 23 years into his enlistment. He had survived Fallujah, Ramadi, and 3 different commandery structures. Very little surprised him. But as he took in the scene, Briggs wheezing on the floor, Zane clutching his limp arm, Miller bleeding onto the linoleum, and Wyatt staring at the wall like a shell-shocked conscript, he actually paused. He looked at the 3 bodies. Then he looked at Cora. She was currently slotting the charging handle into her upper receiver, the metallic snick echoing sharply. Henderson took a slow sip of his coffee. "I leave to take a phone call for 15 minutes, Henderson said. His voice was gravelly, devoid of any panic. 15 minutes, and my briefing room looks like a triage center in Kandahar." Cora didn't look up. "Contractors slipped, floors slick." "Right, slick." Henderson walked forward, his boots carefully avoiding the widening puddle of blood near Miller's head. He looked down at Briggs. The massive man was trying to speak, but only a wet, raspy rattle escaped his throat. His face was a mottled, terrifying shade of purple. Henderson winced. He knew a crushed windpipe when he saw one. "Wyatt!" Henderson barked. The kid jumped, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "Master Chief, go down to the clinic. Tell Doc we need 2 litters and some traction splints. Don't run. Walk fast. If you run, people start asking questions." Wyatt nodded frantically and bolted out the door, eager to escape the suffocating pressure of the room. Henderson pulled up a chair and sat directly across from Cora. He set his clipboard down. For a long moment, the only sound was the ragged breathing of the men on the floor and the precise click of Cora reassembling her weapon. The adrenaline rush was finally starting to recede from her bloodstream. It was a physical crash, a sudden evacuation of neurochemicals that left behind a cold, hollow ache. Her hands wanted to shake. She forced them to remain completely still, gripping the polymer stock of her rifle until her knuckles turned white. She would not give anyone in this room the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. "So," Henderson said quietly, leaning forward, "do you want to tell me why I'm going to spend the next 6 hours doing incident reports?" "He took my weapon, Master Chief." Henderson closed his eyes. A deep, heavy sigh escaped his nose. In their world, that was the entire explanation. Taking another operator's weapon wasn't a prank. It was a physical threat, a challenge to their authority and their life. By the unwritten laws of the community, Briggs had initiated a violent confrontation. Cora had simply finished it. "He touched the rifle?" Henderson asked to clarify. "Snatched the upper receiver right off the mat," she replied, locking the upper and lower halves together with a sharp snap. She pushed the takedown pins into place. The weapon was whole again. "Idiots," Henderson muttered, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He glared at Zane, who was still rocking back and forth on his knees, gritting his teeth against the agony of the dislocated shoulder. "You contractors get a little off-leash freedom, and you forget where you are. You forget who you are." Henderson turned his attention back to Cora. He looked at her critically. He noted the slight hitch in her breathing, the way she favored her left side. She was hurt. Of course she was. You don't throw around that much combined body weight without tearing something in your own architecture. "You good, SEAL?" Henderson asked. It was the first time anyone had used the title without a layer of sarcasm beneath it. "I'm fine. I didn't ask if you were fine. I asked if you were good. Go see Doc after he patches up these clowns. Get your ribs taped." Cora looked up, meeting his eyes. "I don't need a medic." "It wasn't a suggestion," Henderson said softly. "You won the fight, kid. Don't lose the recovery. We have a night op in 48 hours, and I need you breathing without wincing. Understood?" "Understood." Two corpsmen rushed into the room, carrying folded canvas litters. The sterile smell of iodine and clean cotton immediately followed them. They took one look at Briggs and immediately went to work, their movements fast and urgent. The chaotic noise of trauma care filled the space. Velcro ripping, oxygen tanks clinking, sharp commands. Through it all, Cora sat perfectly still. She slung her rifle over her shoulder, picked up her cleaning supplies, and stood up. She walked toward the door, navigating around the medics and the groaning men. Nobody tried to stop her. Nobody made eye contact. As she stepped out into the blinding, dusty heat of the compound, the heavy metal door swung shut behind her, cutting off the noise. She was alone again, just the way they preferred her. The showers in the female barracks were predictably awful. The water pressure was little more than a rusty trickle, and the temperature hovered somewhere between tepid and freezing. Tonight, Cora welcomed the cold. She stood under the spray, her head bowed, letting the icy water wash away the sweat, the solvent, and the lingering scent of copper blood. The cheap fluorescent light overhead flickered, casting harsh, stuttering shadows against the mouldy tile. She pressed her fingertips against her ribs, tracing the line of bone beneath bruised flesh. A sharp, electric jolt of pain radiated outward. Zane had hit her harder than she realized. Her right knuckles were swollen, the skin scraped raw from where she had driven her palm into Briggs's throat. She flexed her hand, testing the ligaments. They held. Everything held. But she was exhausted. A deep, marrow-deep fatigue that no amount of sleep could cure. The media, the brass, the recruiters, they loved the narrative of the unstoppable female warrior. They painted her as a pioneer, breaking glass ceilings with a combat knife. But there was no glory in this. There was no triumphant music. There was only the brutal, cynical reality of waking up every single day and having to prove her right to exist in a room full of men who wanted her to fail. She didn't fight Briggs because she wanted to make a statement. She fought him because he gave her no choice. If she had backed down, if she had let him take her weapon and mock her, the respect she had bled for would have evaporated instantly. In this ecosystem, weakness was blood in the water. You either bite back or you get eaten. Cora turned off the shower. She dried off with a scratchy green towel, dressed in clean, oversized sweatpants and a grey t-shirt, and walked back to her hooch. Her quarters were a 12 by 12 plywood box. A cot, a footlocker, and a small metal fan that pushed hot air in circles. It was bleak, but it was hers. She sat on the edge of the cot and reached into her locker, pulling out a roll of white athletic tape. She took a deep breath, wincing as her lungs expanded against the bruised ribs and began to wrap her torso. It required a painful twisting motion, pulling the tape tight to compress the injury. She was halfway done when a shadow fell across the threshold of her open door. Cora's hand instinctively dropped toward the combat knife resting on her footlocker. "Hey," a voice said. She froze. It was Wyatt. He stood just outside the doorframe, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked smaller than he had in the briefing room. The arrogance had been entirely burned out of him, replaced by a nervous, twitchy energy. Cora didn't invite him in. She just stared at him, her hand hovering inches from the steel blade. "What do you want?" Wyatt shifted his weight, He pulled his right hand out of his pocket. He was holding a plastic bag filled with ice from the mess hall. He held it out awkwardly. "Saw you favor your right side on the way out," Wyatt muttered, looking at her boots rather than her face. "Figured. You know." Cora looked at the bag of ice. It was a peace offering. Or maybe it was an apology. In their world, words like sorry were rarely spoken. "You showed contrition through actions." She reached out and took the bag. The cold plastic felt shockingly good against her skin. "Thanks." Wyatt nodded, turning to leave. But he hesitated. He leaned against the plywood doorframe, looking out into the dark, dusty compound. "Briggs is getting flown out," Wyatt said quietly. "Medevac to Ramstein. Doc said his foot requires surgical pinning. Trachea is severely bruised, but he'll breathe on his own eventually." "Shame," Cora said flatly. Wyatt looked back at her. "He shouldn't have touched your rifle." "No, he shouldn't have." "Zane popped his shoulder back in," Wyatt continued, rubbing the back of his neck. "He's screaming about pressing charges, assault, conduct unbecoming." Cora let out a dry, cynical laugh. "Let him. Master Chief Henderson will bury the paperwork so deep it'll strike oil. You don't get to claim assault when you swing first in a room full of witnesses." "Yeah, I guess not." Wyatt paused. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the things they weren't saying. Finally, Wyatt looked directly at her. "How did you know?" "Know what?" "That Briggs would drop his head when you stomped his foot. You had the throat strike lined up before his heel even hit the floor. You didn't even look." Cora pressed the ice pack against her ribs. She looked at the young contractor. He was looking for a secret, a magic trick. He wanted to know how the laws of physics had been suspended for 79 seconds. "I know how the human body is wired, Wyatt," Cora said softly. "Pain travels up. When you crush a weight-bearing bone, the central nervous system forces a contraction. The body folds to protect the injury. The head always drops. I didn't beat his strength. I just let his own biology do the work." Wyatt absorbed that. He nodded slowly. It wasn't magic. It was terrifying, calculated efficiency. "You're not like the others," Wyatt said. "I'm exactly like the others," Cora replied, her voice hardening. "That's the part you guys can't stand. I passed the same selection. I carried the same boats. I froze in the same surf. I'm not special, Wyatt. I'm just tired of having to explain why I'm here." Wyatt swallowed hard. He gave a sharp, definitive nod. The lesson was learned. "Get some sleep, Seal," Wyatt said softly. "You too." He walked away, his footsteps fading into the gravel of the compound. Cora sat alone on her cot. She finished taping her ribs, secured the ice pack under her shirt, and laid back against the thin, lumpy pillow. The metal fan rattled in the corner. The base was quiet, save for the distant hum of a generator. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow the sun would rise, the heat would return, and she would pick up her rifle and go to work. The war outside the wire was waiting, but for tonight, the war inside the wire was won. She took a slow, painful breath, letting the cold ice numb the ache in her bones, and drifted off into a restless, light sleep. 79 seconds. That was all it took to change the gravity in a room. But tomorrow, she knew, the clock would reset. It always did. If Cora's story struck a chord with you, don't let it stop here. The world is full of quiet professionals, fighting battles behind closed doors, demanding respect not with words, but with undeniable action. Hit the like button to show your support for the underdogs who refuse to stay down. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that grit beats ego every single time. And don't forget to subscribe for more grounded, hard-hitting stories of survival.